Hello, I'm Blaire Lokhorst, a consulting systems engineer at Marco. This meeting will be recorded and we will share out the follow-up email with the links. You can follow up and watch it at a later date. To give you a little bit more about the Marco story, so Marco is a gold certified Cisco partner. And the products that we're going to be talking about today, we do have staff internally in the knowledge to help stand them up, deploy them, and be your experts on it. Today, I've brought on some Cisco folks here to help the conversation that we're going to build that story around the SASE. So, like I said, I'm Blaire Lokhorst, the consulting systems engineer here at Marco. I also have Dave Abbott. He's a Cisco SASE architect. I also have Helen Patton. She's a Cisco advisor, CISO, author, and teacher. I also have Scott Eddy, who's a technical solutions architect at ThousandEyes. So I'm going to kick it over to Dave to have him introduce himself. So Dave.
Great, thanks Blaire. So hello everybody, I'm Dave Abbott. As Blaire said, I am a SASE architect, meaning I have the distinct pleasure to focus on both the SD-WAN side of the house as well as cloud security. This is a newer role for Cisco. We recognize that cross-architecture type deployments are fairly up and coming. And for your environments, that's new as well. We're used to having our pillars of staff, of networking folks, security folks, application folks, right? And yet SASE and cloud have caused us to merge these capabilities together. So I have the distinct pleasure to be able to be part of that cross-architecture journey. I've been with Cisco for 5 years now. I started out in the field as a systems engineer, as a generalist across our entire portfolio. And in the past 6 months, I've moved into this SASE specific role. I've helped many customers like yourselves in both understanding the idea of SASE, understanding what challenges that it helps to address, and then ultimately deploying and adopting those capabilities before I came in this specific role. So I've been in where you are today. I've been in those shoes helping to advise on the deployments and understanding, let's take what we're doing today and move into the future of what we're trying to get to. With that, I'm going to turn it over to some other introductions.
Thanks, Dave. I'll throw it over to Helen. Would you please introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. My name's Helen Patton. I'm an advisory CISO here at Cisco Secure, which means I used to be a CISO in higher education, and I also did security operations and other things in the financial sector. But I've been at Cisco here about 6 months, and I am here to talk about SASE through the lens of security leadership, but particularly around issues of hybrid workforce, some of the things that we're seeing right now around people working from home where they're not sitting on your network, they're not using devices that you own, they may be using devices that you manage, and how do we think about that through the lens of SASE architecture. So happy to be here and talk about that. And yeah, it's going to be great.
All right, thanks. Last, Scott, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Blaire. Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Eddy. I'm a technical solution architect within the ThousandEyes organization. I've been with Cisco for about 5 years. So prior to ThousandEyes, I was a TSA technical solution architect for the enterprise networking business within Cisco. And before that, I operated a national network for a water utility for about 20 years. So I understand the customer's perspective and where observability can play into the SASE story as well.
Thanks for the introductions, team. So I'll throw out a question here to Dave. So Dave, to help level set, do you want to just give a brief overview of what SASE is and how Cisco plays in this space?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And to do that, I've got just a couple of slides here to help us walk through what SASE is and more importantly, why are we talking about it today? So I think as we all know, the network has absolutely evolved due to the application movement into the clouds. right? And we have hybrid cloud deployments in SaaS and infrastructure as a service, private cloud, as well as just general internet browsing. And when we think about how we constructed our networking and security services, it used to be we'd bring it all into a headquarters, but that's ultimately been causing a bottleneck for us. And for a lot of organizations, the reason that they haven't moved away from that type of architecture is because of a significant investment in security in their headquarters or data center. But I want you all to think about an analogy for a second here. Think about the last time you went on a flight. For some with COVID, it may have been 2+ years at this point. For some of you, it might just be getting back into flying. But what's the first thing that you do when you go to book a flight? Well, you enter your destination, sure, but what next? The first thing I know I do is I look for no stops. I don't want to have to do a stop in some other airport and ultimately have that layover. It adds time. It adds challenges around my scheduling. I have to worry about, is an hour layover enough? If a flight's delayed, am I going to miss my next flight? No one wants to go through a layover. Now, unfortunately, that's what most of our networks are doing. They're requiring a layover. And the thing is, if we take that analogy a step further, let's think about it as if the airport said, hey, you have to do a layover with us. And the only reason is because I don't trust the TSA at your regional airport. I'm only going to trust my TSA that's at my hub here. So not only do you have to do the layover, but you're going to have to go through our TSA again. Would you fly with that airline anymore? I know I wouldn't. I'd want to be able to go directly to my destination and be able to go through the regional TSA that's local to me. That's what SASE is trying to solve for, giving us direct connectivity to wherever our applications live without requiring that layover. So a number of the different leading market researchers that are out there, Gartner, Forrester, ESG, are all saying the same thing. But Gartner is ultimately the one that coined the term of SASE, or Secure Access Service Edge, back in 2019. But it boils down to a very simple concept that we need to reduce complexity, improve performance by converging connectivity, security, and identity functions together into a cloud-native aggregation model. It allows us to address users, no matter where they are, to be able to get to their applications, no matter where the applications are, but do it with direct connectivity and integrating security into a seamless cloud aggregation model. So how does Cisco do that? Well, we directly integrate those three pillars together into our SASE approach. On the connectivity side, we have Cisco's SD-WAN. On security, we utilize our secure web gateway through Umbrella. And on identity, we utilize zero trust access policies through Duo Multifactor and Duo Network Gateway. And what's important about this in a holistic, unified approach is that we're able to integrate a visibility policy and integration strategy around all three of these pillars. And that visibility is critical for day two operations and implementation. So Cisco's able to provide every single one of these building blocks, where then we're investing a significant amount of our research and development to continuous integrations across these pillars. That's how we're addressing SASE today. And recognize that SASE is not all that new. We've had SD-WAN for years. And before SD-WAN, it was DMVPN and IWAN, right? We've had proxies for years. That's not necessarily new. But the idea of combining a branch topology as well as secure remote worker topology into a cloud-native secure web gateway, that's the new concept. That's the new way that ultimately organizations are going to have to shift their architecture to be able to move into this new cloud-native model set. So with that, we now have a brief understanding of what SASE is and what Cisco's approach to SASE is.
Thanks, Dave, for that. That was a great overview. So what are we seeing today that is driving customers to think about SASE? Helen, I'll call on you.
Yeah, sure. So, of course, COVID, are we sick of saying COVID yet? I'm sick of saying COVID. Really, it's about the way the workforce is changing and the way we work changing. So, and I'm going to, again, approach this through the lens of security leadership. In previous ways of working, we would have the majority of our employees come onto a office location, into an office location, and sit in an office and do their thing. Now, occasionally we'd have people out in the field. We might have salespeople out in the field, or we may have researchers out in the field if you're higher ed or whatever. But in general, the bulk of your workforce was on-prem. And we built our security stack with that in mind. We said, well, we're going to make the basis of our security portfolio physical security. So we get into employee badge swipes and cameras and those kinds of things. And then once you're in there from a digital perspective, we're going to run your data across our network edge. And that's where we're going to apply the security controls. And we're going to assume that when you're on campus, once you're past the physical security, once your data comes over our firewall, we're going to imply a very high level of trust. And that's how we're going to manage security. And then cloud started to happen, and we found that even if people were on-prem, they were now accessing SaaS applications that weren't. But it still sort of made sense because we were still physically controlling the assets people were using to access those applications. We were physically controlling their bodies and where they worked. And we were still able to say that the data was going to traverse our network edge. And so it still made sense to put security controls there. And now here we are where the majority of our folk are not on-prem anymore, probably won't be on-prem anymore in terms of the majority of the time, even if they're in a hybrid mode. And they're sitting on an unsecure network, accessing SaaS-based applications mostly, particularly for our administrative systems. Operationally, for a manufacturing company or maybe a hospital, that might be a little bit different. So there's always going to be this on-prem, off-prem hybrid environment that we have to think about. But in general, from a person device perspective, they're in an unmanaged environment, they're unmanaged physically, and they're accessing stuff where our data sits, which is no longer within our physical bubble. And so we get into this question of zero trust and being able to make sure that the access is provisioned, that we're assessing the security profile of an individual at the time they ask for access to an asset. And it also means that to Dave's point, we're not going to suck all of their data back on-prem just to push it back out to the cloud, just so we can put some security toll gates in front of it. So we need now to say the security elements of our tech stack are no longer sitting at the network layer. Instead, they're as close to the data as we can possibly make it. And right now, that does mean secure web gateways typically. That's where we're going to put some of our stuff. Sometimes we may be able to reach directly into the application or the database and provide security controls there through CASB and other things. But in general, it's going to be those web gateways that where the bulk of the security controls are applied from a monitoring perspective, from an authentication perspective. And so that hybrid work has, one, changed the risk profile of most of our organizations now to say we've got the bulk of our risk is with the data, not with the device, not with the network stack. And to be able to say that yeah, we're going to combine security and networking in the SASE model because operationally that makes sense. But from a security perspective, from a user behavior analytics perspective, we're going to get as close to the top of the tech stack as we possibly can and apply those controls based on real-time information. And so the integration of the tech stack and the security stack becomes so much more important in that space because you need real-time visibility and real-time control. And that's what SASE architecturally promises. There's work to be done still. It's not a perfect system yet, but it is much more aligned to a hybrid work environment than the old models used to be.
Thanks, Helen. Dave, would you talk about the application side of the infrastructure a little bit?
Absolutely. So some of the things to think about here that's initiating the change, Helen directly addressed hybrid work and that people are working from everywhere now, and we can't clearly define a perimeter. But the other side of the coin of what's initiating this change is cloud adoption and the application level of where our apps live. And ultimately, we're trying to achieve a number of different outcomes through a SASE model, which ultimately then gets us to direct connectivity and a better user experience. So some of the main outcomes, business outcomes that SASE looks to solve when looking to a cloud model, and especially where our applications and internet traffic are primarily out to the cloud, is one, to be able to reduce cost. I want to be able to set up infrastructure that now can scale as I grow and is cloud native. Doesn't require me to continuously buy a whole bunch of hardware on-prem and all these different branches, and now I got to worry about my firewall scale and sizing, right? So move it into a cloud native infrastructure and help reduce costs, both on a operational expense and capital expenditure, but then as well, my management expenses. The second is to improve that user experience. I want to be able to give my employees direct access to their applications in a much faster manner than having to hairpin all that traffic back in. When my end users are having a better user experience, ultimately they're able to get more work done. And we can directly model return on investments around the latency or downtime that's caused by some of these legacy type architectures to then correlate to employee productivity and some of those cost savings there. The third is minimized risk, just as Helen was talking about. We recognize that as more and more applications are moving to the cloud, we're increasing our attack surface. And we need to be able to adopt modern topologies and architectures that allow us to minimize that risk as there's increased shadow IT and applications that are being delivered that we don't even recognize as security and networking admins. So having increased visibility is absolutely critical there, as well as increasing the types of security controls that we can implement. I think one of the things that's very typical in a secure remote worker model was to have some type of DNS and content filter rule and then have a endpoint protection, right? An anti-malware or antivirus. And then to get into our applications, we'd have VPN. And usually we'd kind of call that a day. Maybe we'd have an MDM control that looked at, operational software version controls and ensure that we don't have any vulnerabilities. But for the most part, it was a relatively small tech stack. What we're seeing is more folks are now requiring a deeper level of visibility and control to get into those applications, to see what's actually going on from my end user to that application, whether it's data loss prevention rules or CASB type controls, as Helen alluded to. Maybe it's identity controls to certain applications or file type controls. I want to be able to have more granular policy sets than just content filtering and antivirus. And that's been a dramatic change in a secure remote worker strategy over the past 3-4 years. So the ability to minimize risk is a huge outcome that we're trying to deliver. And the final one is one that we typically are not seeing addressed right out the gate, but it's something that ends up being a benefit in the long run. And that's the ability to enable new business scenarios and ultimately deliver speed to market. By adopting cloud native architectures, we now can adopt new applications faster without having to worry about any of the undercomings that a traditional networking architecture, it precludes us to. It bottlenecks that traffic. If we can move into a cloud native architecture, it allows us to adopt new services faster and ultimately deliver a better speed to market. So that becomes an ancillary benefit to adopting a SASE approach.
Thanks, Dave. Scott, would you talk to the visibility, the impacts on a modern day WAN network, and how users are impacted with the implementation of SASE?
Obviously, SASE is critical to our new way of working, right? As Dave and Helen already pointed out. But really, when you get down to it, what matters a lot is the digital experience, right? As we move to these new cloud-based services, whether they're ISPs or whether they're SaaS applications or whether it's a cloud delivered security service, right? The digital experience for our employees as well as our customers is critical for the business, and ThousandEyes actually gives you that observability across the entire landscape end to end for those applications. So in the old world, like Dave was talking about earlier, right, everything was in a single control domain where you had control over everything. You could monitor all your devices. You knew where your users were. They were always at the office, connected with some sort of costly carrier service to your data center that had some sort of SLA backed with it, right? And now we're moving out to a new world where we're dependent on third-party internet service providers, content delivery networks, DNS, SaaS applications, as well as cloud-delivered security. And we need to understand end-to-end what our employee and customer digital experience looks like. And ThousandEyes provides that. Your apps and your microservices are really spread across the cloud and the internet. The cloud has become your new data center. SaaS has become the new application stack. The internet has become your WAN, and it's really difficult with traditional tools to understand what the experience is across those different types of services. And as we all know, right, the working from home has become the new office, the new branch office. So we have to be able to see that visibility from wherever your users happen to be or wherever your customers happen to be. If you have a customer facing website, how are your customers experiencing that application, right? And ThousandEyes contributes that and gives you the ability to monitor the digital experience from that perspective.
Thanks, Scott, for that. So we just heard a lot of different moving parts about SASE, and every customer is on their own journey. Let's break it down into components. Helen, with so many different companies moving to a hybrid workforce, we see customers struggle with user and device identity. What are the implications of this, and how should customers think about this?
Yeah, so I think that the answer to this question is it goes back to what's managed and what's not managed. So on the user identity side, you're going to have employees, but we also know that we have non-employees who still need access to our assets, right? So you're going to need architecturally a way of being able to capture those identities and validate that they are who they say they are. So this is where MFA comes into play to first validate the identity. So you're going to need to find a way within your identity management system to support different kinds of users. It might be employees, it might be contractors, it might be partners who, particularly in the hospital systems, there's a ton of people who need access to hospital systems who aren't employees of the hospital directly, but are medical partners of other practices. So you're going to need a way of being able to identify and catalog those, and you're going to need a way of being able to know what typical behavior is for those, which can be, the more complicated your user environment is internal. I'm not even talking about customers here for a second, but just that internal ecosystem of people, the more complicated it becomes in terms of understanding what quote unquote normal is. So we look for security signals around users, like where are they logging in from? What time of day are they logging in from? What kinds of devices are they using to authenticate with? So there's the device you log in with, there's the device you authenticate with. Hopefully it's not a one-time push kind of thing. Hopefully it's a more secure authentication method, like a YubiKey or maybe passwordless biometrics on your devices. But regardless, that linkage between the user and the authentication device establishes credibility of the users. So how do you think about that? If you're in the kind of vertical where you have people logging in all the time into multiple devices, like doctors do, or like teachers do in classrooms, that can become a really complicated scenario. So it does take some real pre-thought to think about how that's going to work. And then you've got the device thing. And what we're seeing particularly now is, yeah, in a lot of verticals, we're still handing out managed devices. We do this at Cisco. You know, we're going to do this at JP Morgan. When I was there, you don't get to plug your own personal device into the wireless or the Wi-Fi or the wired networks in your ecosystems anymore. But really what we're seeing is people want to be able to do their work from anywhere on any kind of device. And so now you've got devices you own and manage, and that's typically what you see in your CMDBs. but you've got devices that you don't own and you don't manage, and you still need a way of being able to validate that those devices are trustworthy. So you get into questions like, is there an EDR solution we can put on the endpoint that will let us know what the configuration of the endpoint is in real time, connected to your threat intel, so you can start to see through an extended detection and response kind of capability what is happening on the endpoint. So mid-session, if somebody clicks on a bad link and automatically starts downloading malware, or pre-session they clicked on a bad link, they had malware already on their device, and in the middle of a session we start to see a whole chunk of data being sent out to a command and control server, we're going to need ways to be able to deal with that, whether the device is managed or not. The one wrinkle to that, the main wrinkle to that is privacy. So when you're dealing with people's personally owned devices, or at least devices that you don't own as the institution, you're going to have to be able to have something on the endpoint that is enough for you to be able to see the configuration of the device, but not so much that you necessarily see all the data and you start bumping into privacy concerns. Particularly certain jurisdictions in Europe and Asia and others are really finicky about that. So you're going to have to think about, yes, you need to identify the individual, whether they're employees or not. You're going to have to be able to identify the endpoint, whether or not it's a company owned and managed device or a personally owned device, but you're going to have to do that in the context of privacy management as well. So it becomes really super complicated. So yay, this is why we're here, right? Trying to work it out.
Thanks, Helen. Scott, can you shed some light into the concept of observability and why it is so important?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously what's important is the experience that our employees and our customers are having with our applications, right? And really observability just gives us the means of understanding who's responsible for any type of service degradation, right? Whether that's the ISP, whether it's the SaaS provider, whether it's some other service that we're using in the cloud like DNS. So ThousandEyes gives us the insight into all of those services out on the internet and the experience end to end for the user. And what it does is it allows us to lessen our mean time to identify who owns the problem, right? So there's always, in the past, there's been finger pointing. It's the app problem. Oh, it's the network. Oh, it's this guy. Oh, it's that guy. ThousandEyes really gives you that visibility end to end to say, this is where the problem exists, and it tells you who the owner of that problem would be, whether it's the ISP or the DNS provider or the cloud provider that's out there, right? So being able to understand not only the experience that our employees and that our customers are having, but if they're having a bad experience, who owns the problem, right? So that's really what ThousandEyes does from a 50,000 level view.
Thanks, Scott. Dave, Cisco has a ton of different options, hardware, software perspective. So how do we know what solution may be a right fit for a customer?
Yeah, that's the thing that always comes up when we start going down a SASE journey and recognize, wow, okay, I might have some gaps I need to fill. What direction do I go? How do I prioritize these projects? And I think one thing that's important to identify right out the gate is that SASE is a framework to utilize, to use as a tool set to recognize how we can get better application performance, how we can get more cloud native security in our environment. But it's not something that's a singular product. SASE is not a singular product, right? It's a framework. And so we have to then figure out how we want to go from where we are today to what our end goal, what our future state's going to be, and take several steps along that journey to get there. The benefit at Cisco is we have multiple options in terms of the level of technical depth and feature sets that we can provide, as well as the scale that's required, and we can meet you wherever you are. And an example could be with application access. A typical deployment for many is they are using VPN to backhaul into the data center for their applications. They might have configured split tunneling, but for the most part, they have to turn on a VPN to get into a lot of their applications, or they're using some kind of virtual desktop infrastructure, right? VDI deployment for that. And they want to start moving into a more zero trust network access type model that allows them a per application authentication framework rather than I got to backhaul all my traffic. But getting there is a journey. And the benefit with Cisco is we have the capability to provide a full tunnel or split tunnel VPN. We have managed VPN services. We also have zero trust network access capabilities. So depending on where you are at the journey, we can easily meet you there. In terms of the process to identify that, there's a couple steps that I usually recommend taking. The first would be to recognize where your applications are today, right? Are the majority of my high touch applications, the business critical applications, are they still on premise? Are they hosted by a partner, or are they a SaaS-based application? And another thing to think about isn't just where are we today, but also what's our roadmap in 3 to 5 years. I have a number of customers that I was working with that were very cloud adverse, but they started to recognize, oh, Microsoft's really going to push us off this Exchange server with support pretty soon here. I'm going to have to look at Office 365, whether I like it or not. And that's a stark reality for many, that you have to start looking at cloud adoption, whether you really planned on it or not. You're slowly going to be forced that way with certain applications where it's required to be hosted. And so understanding not just where you are today from an application perspective, but then where you're going as an organization is critically important, because you don't want your infrastructure to be playing catch up. We go back to that ability to have greater speed and agility. If you set your networking up today for where your applications are going to live tomorrow, that gives you a much better response and application experience, as well as security posture. So once you know where your applications are today, where they're going, we then need to understand where our users are. Are they working out of a branch site? Are they working out of a headquarters? Or are they remote worker? I know we can't predict what COVID's going to do, but we can assume we're going to have some form of a hybrid work strategy moving forward. It's very rare institutions are back to 100% in person. And so we have to define what that long-term strategy is for users, understanding, okay, what's the networking and security stack look like for their remote user compared to someone working out of a branch? And then understanding then what's that application flow as they're going from their different locations to all these different applications we just discussed. From there, we have to understand what our risk tolerance is. And this goes all into what Helen was just discussing of understanding as a CISO, where do I need to put the majority of my enforcement? What types of identity policies do I need to create? Are we going to continue to only have our unmanaged devices out in the wild, or are we going to open up some kind of bring your own device policy? These are all discussions that have to be figured out internally, both for compliance reasons and regulation, whether you're getting audited in certain things, depending on your industry, as well as then how critical your information is or where your applications are. If you have high intellectual property value and you really can't get hacked because of that, we're going to put more risk mitigation in place because of that. Or if you're very sensitive to negative public relations and you don't want any news to spread about your organization being hacked, that's again another area where understanding how risk averse we are as an org really comes into play to how deep our security needs to be. Finally, let's understand what our key business drivers are. Application performance, uptime, is it the bad PR? Is it, latency issues? Whatever it may be, understanding from an IT perspective what those key business drivers are going to be, what helps the organization be successful. That then leads us to what types of projects we need to prioritize first within SASE. It could be we identify that SD-WAN is our next route of implementation. We want to be able to provide direct connectivity. It could be securing the remote workforce with more robust security tool sets is an avenue we need to explore first. But eventually determining, using this framework, where the different gaps are in our infrastructure, and then leveraging the priorities that we just discussed, that allows us to then figure out, okay, how do we need to go to market on this, and which different technologies do we need to start implementing first? Then we could bring it back to Cisco and to Marco, and ultimately looking to have advice on, okay, this is where we are today, and this is where we want to go. These are our top priorities first, and here's what our current capabilities are. Having a realistic understanding of what your internal teams can do, what they can manage, then sets you up for success. It could be that we're a very lean IT that needs simple deployments, and we can't have much in terms of a complex policy setup. Could be that we're a very robust global organization that needs multiple people that are dedicated to a solution. Cisco can meet you wherever you are in that journey, but we just need some, I guess, guidance from you of your priorities and where your staff is today. And it could be you determine that maybe I need a managed solution for this, that maybe I need some type of managed SD-WAN or managed security profiling, or someone that's looking over my shoulder and ensuring that what I'm doing is actually to the book and I'm doing things correctly. That's where services comes in. So having a realistic understanding of where you are today and what your top priorities are then helps us align our technology capabilities as well as services that are required to set you up for success in the long term with SASE.
Thanks, Dave. Helen, I'm sure when you're talking to your CISO peers, you get a lot of questions on where to start. Can you provide any tips and tricks?
I think Dave actually covered a lot of that in his previous comments. When I talk to CISOs, we always tend to look at where are we facing threats first. So there's sort of a combination of what are the threats that our organization faces and what are the critical business functions that we need to protect the most, and where the intersection of that is, that can be a place to apply the SASE framework. So you may have, for example, everyone's sort of dealing with ransomware. It's a thing, but sort of this question of we've got an availability threat that looks like ransomware. What would be the systems in our organization that we have that if those things were unavailable, they're going to be really problematic for us? So again, in the medical space, it might be your medical records database. In the higher ed space, it might be your student information system. Whatever your vertical is, there's going to be something that you go, wow, if that thing really messes us up, if that thing goes down, we're really going to struggle. So those can be the right place. On the other hand, if the controls you're putting in place are really going to be impactful on your end users, and this might be introducing MFA for the first time, hopefully you've already got MFA, but maybe haven't, or doing something that's going to change the way people work. A lot of CISOs would choose not to do that in the most high-risk location first. They might pick something that's a little probably less risky, but also is more representative of the rest of the organization, and try and find a pilot group that's going to give you the most information back in terms of whether it works or whether it doesn't. So, just like Dave said, as an organization, there's going to be a lot of variables that are unique to the organization. Deciding where to start is that. Now, what I am finding though is if organizations didn't have a lot of remote working or hybrid working happening before COVID, they are tending to work on the user device combination as the place to start, because they lost visibility to those assets when people started working from home. So the other consideration is, where are you blind from a security perspective? And if there are places in your tech stack that you can't see right now, even if you don't have the tools to actually attend to what you find when you start looking, you might want to start putting those security controls in place that gives you the visibility that's going to be the beginning of deciding whether or not you've got risk that needs to be mitigated. So some options there.
Thanks, Helen. Dave, why is it important to approach SASE with a unified solution?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, SASE is a cross-architecture deployment. It goes across multiple domains, as we covered at the beginning of the session. You've got networking components, you have security components, you have identity and application components, And a lot of times that falls to different teams. We at Cisco are the same exact way, where we have specialists in each one of them. And I look at how a lot of my customers were trying to strategize on adopting cloud several years ago, whether it was SaaS deployments or infrastructure as a service deployments. It was the same concept. You had networking, security, application, storage, right? InfoSec, all of it tying together. And a lot of customers ended up creating tiger teams. They would take the lead architect of each one of those pillars and then bring them together and try to come up with a solution to vet out different cloud providers. SASE is not all that different from how organizations have to handle cloud deployments, in the sense of there's a lot of overlap in terms of role and responsibility. We've got connectivity tying in on the networking folks. Security team wants to overlay their policies to it all. And ultimately, we need a way to have visibility and troubleshoot that multiple teams need access to. And so having a one vendor approach provides an ability to come together and recognize, okay, all these tools are in the same ecosystem. We need to work together to understand where our lines of responsibility are going to be. But it doesn't have to be by ownership of one product versus the other. And a great example of that's a firewall. Typically, networking team might own the firewall ports and protocols and connections, but the security team then owns a lot of the policies that live in it, or maybe networking owns some of the access control lists, and everyone has their own line in the sand, but it's on one piece of device. SASE needs to be the same way that networking and security teams have to come together to define these policies and define an architecture together. And if you have multiple vendors in there that you're trying to piecemeal together and service chain, it's going to end up becoming an admin nightmare. So having a unified solution provides a way for your teams to be able to come together and have a holistic discussion on a architecture that's already documented, tested, and solidified. I think the other thing to think about too is not just where are our solutions today, but where are they going in the next 3 years? It's been very interesting to see the SASE market evolve just in the past 2 years. 2 years ago, right, Zscaler was the leading secure web gateway in the marketplace, but they don't have an SD-WAN solution. They don't have an identity solution. And you saw a lot of SD-WAN vendors partnering with Zscaler to address these needs. And that was the lead methodology for people to deploy. And now the folks that Zscaler was partnering with are making their own secure web gateway. Palo Alto and VMware, they all have conflicts of interest all of a sudden. Cisco's the same way. And we're very quickly seeing Zscaler kind of getting left on the side because they don't have a holistic unified solution. So keep that in mind of not just what's available today, but where is the roadmap? Where are we headed from a unified solution? Two other things just quickly to consider. One is that unified backend support. Being able to quickly identify where a challenge is, whether it's SD-WAN or whether it's something going on in my web gateway. Maybe it's identity issues, maybe it's a visibility tool. But with Cisco, we're all one team on the back end. And when you open that support ticket, we can cross-launch between those teams quite seamlessly. Compare that to you trying to juggle multiple different point products together. Now you're the person stuck in the middle trying to coordinate communications. That's never a fun challenge. And then finally, that idea that SASE is a journey. It lets you grow at your own pace. If you are, have the idea to sign up and say an enterprise agreement or a licensing agreement, it allows you to then scale and grow as your organization needs without having to set up all new contracts and additional vendor management. You start with where the direct need is based on your business priorities, and then you grow that through a documented unified solution. That's ultimately what Cisco is able to provide from a SASE approach.
Thanks, Dave. So we'll open it up for some Q&A. If anybody has any questions out there, we'd love to get them answered. And it looks like we have one question that came in here. So supply chain management, how does that fit into the SASE framework? I don't know who wants to take that, Dave or Helen or Scott.
I'll jump in. It's not a direct use case, I don't think, for SASE. I think SASE is, to Dave's point, it's a framework that's going to help you with the operations and the security of your cloud or hybrid environments, which is great, but it's not specifically for supply chain security. I think it can help with supply chain management, in terms of the access management pieces of it. So again, understanding who your contractors are, whether they're coming and engaging with your systems in a secure kind of way. But when we talk about supply chain security, these days we're really sort of talking about how do we validate that the software we're using in our environments are secure and remain secure. And maybe Scott has an opinion about that from a ThousandEyes perspective, I'm not sure, but purely from a SASE perspective, it will help, but it's not the target use case of SASE architecture. I'm going to throw it at Dave and Scott and see if they disagree with me.
No, I think, Helen, you're right on the spot there, right? And ThousandEyes obviously can help with that visibility into the application and the security to that application, right? So we may have to cross multiple third-party networks to get to those supply chain applications, and we can do that, right? We can give you that visibility. We can make sure that your data's not hijacked en route and all those type of things from a security perspective. But yeah, I think you're right. I don't think it's a direct use case, but I think it's more about securing the assets and the applications in the cloud.
The one thing I'll touch on there is when we talk SASE, we address it like it's a framework. And the way that I look at it is it's primarily for outbound communications of your end user getting to an application. There is a lot of overlap in the principles of that framework to zero trust. And to me, zero trust is what can directly address a lot of that supply chain management in terms of how you handle application access and identity controls. And Duo is certainly a linchpin that crosses both of those chasms from a framework perspective. I would say that SASE is more of a let's get our end users, our employees, to be able to have direct access to their applications. Now, one other thing of overlap would be if I have a contractor that might be on-prem in one of my facilities, and I want to ensure that they're able to not go into any malicious sites while on my infrastructure, I can create identity controls and content filtering rules that say, okay, you can't go to these types of sites when you're within my infrastructure, and it allows me to handle supply chain management that way. But from a external contractor or user coming into some of my application controls, that's mainly going to be in Duo as well as other zero trust principles.
Perfect. So can SASE replace VPNs?
Yeah, I'll start on that one too. VPN can be a part of a SASE architecture. There are some folks out there that say provocative statements that VPN is dead and the networking is no more and everything's cloud-based. And while architectures might be moving in that direction, it is certainly not true today in this networking landscape. Majority of customers still utilize VPN in their infrastructure. And the fact is, even SD-WAN has its VPN deployments, right? We're running an IPsec tunnel, and there's various levels of a tunneling technology that we're digesting in most SASE architectures. I think the one that folks can sometimes get tripped up on, or we have to just clarify, is how are we defining application access? And a lot of times we rely on VPN for application access. And what we're seeing is customers are starting to evolve into more of a zero trust network access or private access type framework that is on a per application basis and is handled by zero trust principles around your identity and what types of application controls you can get to, rather than giving you a holistic, oh, you signed in, now you're into my whole network. So we're seeing that movement, but it certainly doesn't mean that we're replacing VPNs anytime soon. And in a lot of SASE deployments today, VPN is still a critical part of that storyline.
Yeah, and a lot of applications are encrypting themselves, right? So VPN isn't totally necessary to the application because it's got its own encryption built into it.
Looks like we got time for one more question. How should SASE fit into your existing technology stack?
I think the one, I'll get started and I'll let others comment on it, but to me, it goes back to the journey discussion, understanding where you are today and identify the gaps of what your current infrastructure is providing. And also recognizing too, that sometimes we have to tear down certain walls in order to build new ones. I see a lot of organizations are very hesitant with the idea of moving into this direct internet access or moving into a cloud proxy and bypassing some of the existing controls. It's not a rip off the Band-Aid all at once type of approach, right? You don't have to go that way. We can be strategic in how we implement, but understanding that this isn't a bolt on to your current architecture. We're fundamentally changing the way that we are approaching application access with SASE. So identifying where some of the gaps are to this framework and then seeing how we're currently implemented today. If we're doing a lot of that hub spoke or backhauling into a centralized data center, let's look at how we can start to change that environment to allow better agility and security and performance across your different applications. So there are integrations for sure, but let's not consider it just as a bolt-on or another security capability. This is a fundamental re-architecture of how we go to market.
Yeah, and on top of that, ThousandEyes was invented on that principle alone, right? Being able to have the observability across the new framework of the internet, right? That's the delivery network that we're choosing in most of these cases, and that's specifically why ThousandEyes was invented in 2010, was to see that end-to-end visibility across wherever your application takes you.
I'd also layer on in 2020, Cisco commissioned a survey of security teams, 1,300 of them, multiple countries, multiple verticals, and it resulted in a study called the Security Outcome Study, which you can get without registering on the Cisco website. The premise of the SOS was to be able to say, what are the practices that result in a good security outcome? So how do you know that your security program is working properly? And the two lead things that across all verticals, all locations, all industries, all sizes of industry held true was, one, having a refreshed tech stack, and two, having a fully integrated security stack with your tech stack. So SASE embodies both of those things, right? So, you know, if you're going to go down the path of having a cloud environment of any way, shape or form, any piece of your world being cloud, you're going to need to have a fully integrated security solution to go along with it, so that you get the visibility, so that you can see things happening in real time, so that you can defend effectively, but also respond quickly if things go sideways. That's what this is really about. From it, again, through the very selfish lens of security, forget IT operations and the other efficiencies that you get along with it, but purely from a security play, that's the value of SASE.
Well, thanks, Dave, Scott, and Helen for joining us today. I think we covered a lot of information here. Thanks, customers, for coming on and spending an hour with us. If you guys want to learn a little bit more, you know, one-on-one or more in-depth conversation in around SASE and how we can come in and help you start your journey, reach out to the account rep and that invited you to the meeting, and we would love to spend some more one-on-one and really dive deep into your environment to help you secure everything for the future. Thanks, Kim, for setting all of this up, and I do appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.